Kids have got it so good these days. The modern bikes and the modern tech that you can get on kids' bike is truly amazing. And yeah, what the kids can get up to is just unlimited. Thanks to SR Sun Tour, we're going to walk through how to set up your kids' bike so they can get the most out of riding it. A great example of how far kids' bikes have come is this tiny rock here. It's got a 4-bar suspension system with 120mm of travel, front and rear. It's got hydraulic disc brakes, 4-pot no less, 1-bar drivetrain. It's amazing, it's state-of-the-art stuff. So just like your mountain bike and how you worry about 10mm reach here or maybe 15mm of extra seat post dropper, size is super important for kids as well. And whilst we know that kids grow really, really quickly, and it's really tempting then to buy a bike that they'll grow into, our advice is not to do that. And we're not saying that just because we want more bikes to be sold. No, we're saying it because we want the best ride experience for your child. And that experience is going to be the best on a bike that fits them. Exactly like if you or I were going to ride a bike that was 2 sizes too big, all the geometry and how the bike rides and how the bike feels is going to be completely different on that bigger bike. And we can't just kind of switch wheel sizes or do something like that. We can switch stems, we could trim bars, and obviously we can adjust the saddle height, but do make sure that your kid fits on the bike from day one. They'll have an amazing experience and they'll get that love of riding that you've got and I've got. But it does take some time to set it up properly to get the most out of it, and that's what we're going to do now. We're going to start with the controls. On a modern kids' bikes, you've got hydraulic disc brakes or powerful V-brakes, but they've got loads of power, so we don't need to see kids with 4 little fingers trying to pull the bike to a stop. With the right setup, they should be able to pull 1 finger or maybe 2 fingers, depending on hand strength. So we're going to look at brake setup first because we want to slow down before we can go. With lots of these modern brakes, there's lots of adjustments. Some of them are going to have independent dials for reach, and that's really key actually, is setting them up so that the little tucker can reach the brake levers with just 1 finger at best. But make sure that you also pull the lever. So for example, with this one's almost pulling to the bar, and obviously you don't want the brake to bottom out on the handlebar because then you're not going to stop in time. Well, you're not going to stop, but your child may not stop, which is probably more of a concern. So play around with the reach adjuster and your child's finger to help get that setup dialed in. Once we've worked on the reach of the lever, so that's as it's pulling into the bar, the next thing to do is just check the angle of it. What we recommend is something around just up from 45 degrees, just to get maximum power for those small hands. But obviously adjust it for the kind of needs and strength of your child's hands. So after we've set the brakes up, our next port of call is getting the shifter in the right spot. This will be limited to a degree on where the brake lever is, but you should be able to get it in a good position. Again, make sure it's not just good position for you, but a good position for those smaller hands of the little rider. Gone are the days when kids' bikes came with adult grips that were oversized for smaller hands. Kids' bikes now come with, well, a grip that will look a lot like an adult's one, but will be a little bit slimmer. And if that's not the case, you can switch them out. There's lots of slim grip options out there. Setting a saddle height is slightly trickier. There's no magic formula like there is with setting your saddle height as an adult. And there's going to be a couple of factors, and the main factor is how comfortable and confident your child is at riding. And that's because, well, they're still going to need to put a foot down. So if they're coming to a stop, you don't want them to wobble around and bobble around too much. So make sure that even if they're really confident, they can still put a foot flat on the floor. It'll just help with them pedaling uphill, or if they're coming to more technical trails. Okay, getting the saddle height is really important because it really helps them get a decent power through the pedals, which really helps keep their momentum, because it can be a real stumbling block when kids are new to riding. They hit the first climb and they grind to a halt, particularly when they haven't quite mastered gear changing yet, and it does take patience from young ones and especially from you. So learning to shift gears smoothly takes a bit of time, so whilst kids are getting used to that, make sure that the saddle height is just on the right side of low, that they'll be able to put their feet down and be stable. Saddle height is tricky. We've cautioned about running it too high and the dangers of kids not being able to get their feet down. Well, also if you run the saddle too low, it can be tricky as well. Why, you ask? Well, if kids are just learning to ride out of the saddle and they're kind of standing and they're getting used to that process, they could easily slip a pedal, or they could just not have the leg strength to support themselves. So if the saddle is really, really low and they have this kind of moment of either a slip pedal or a lack of leg strength, and they come crashing down onto where they think the saddle is, but it's really low, it can cause them to be off balanced and potentially crash. So getting the saddle in this Goldilocks magic point where it's not too high that they can't get their feet down and not too low that it causes them to be unbalanced when they're sitting back down on it is the magic point. So just to recap, running it on the side of too low is probably the better option, because it means, okay, if they're starting to get confident and pedal out of the saddle, there could be mishaps. But in general, it's probably better lower because we know that they'll be able to get a foot down. And much like Sam Hill, getting a foot down in a corner is really rad. So why would your kids not want to do it too? Okay, now we're getting to the fun stuff of a really fun and exciting kids bike, and that's suspension. This stuff from Suntour is really impressive, and this Radon 34 is exactly the same as the non-junior 20-inch version. So this one's got a compression dampening lockout, it's got adjustable rebound, and it's got adjustable air pressure or preload. And that's really useful, actually essential, because we need to set sag. On the rear shock, we've also got similar adjustments. We've got compression damping, we've got rebound, and we've got air pressure as well to set that sag. So a brief explainer of what sag is. Measuring sag on a suspension fork is easy, and it's a good starting point because the travel ratio is 1:1. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that the travel of the fork is literally 170 mil. So at full travel, this O-ring here, when it's fully bottomed out, will hit this seal, and you can measure 170 mil. So it's simple to set up sag on a fork. Setting sag on the rear of the bike is a little bit more complicated because opposed to having a 1:1 ratio, like the fork will often have a different ratio. And again, what do I mean by ratio? Okay, so on the rear of your bike, you're going to have 150 or 160 mil of travel. That's at the rear axle. The shock isn't moving as much as that, and that's because of where the pivots are and how the shock is levered. So its leverage ratio is going to be slightly different. With this bike, it's got a 55 mil stroke and 160 mil, so it's roughly a 3:1 ratio. Ideally, with all your riding kit on, sit on the bike, bounce up and down a number of times. This opens up any friction in the system, so everything's active. Then sit steady on the bike. Slide the O-ring or marker, say like a zip tie, against the shock body or fork body. Then carefully get off the bike. Measure the gap between the O-ring or zip tie and the seal. We're aiming for about 20% of sag on the fork, and we're aiming for about 30% of sag on the rear shock. Do check with your bike or suspension brand for guidance on sag setup. If your bike is sat down too deep into the travel on both the forks and the shock, you need to increase the spring pressure. If your bike is sat too little into the travel on both the fork and the shock, we need to decrease the spring pressure. Use a shock pump to bleed out the air and reduce the pressure in the shocks, which reduces the spring rate. So that's how to set sag. Now, sometimes to get the perfect setup, it's a little bit of trial and error. So take a shock pump out with you and play. Try some different sections of trail. The rough guidance is that you want to bottom out your suspension fully at least once on your trail. And obviously, if you ride different trails, you might need a more conservative and slightly firmer setting, but get out there and play. Enjoy playing with your suspension. Sag is where the suspension system sags underweight into its travel. So if we've got 120 mil of travel here, we're going to sag in about 20 to 25 mil, and that's the sag. And to change that, we're going to change the preload. So with this really nice stuff, we've got an air valve inside or an air spring. On other systems, it might be a coil spring. And we talk about preload, and that means we're increasing that spring, whether it be air or a metal coil, and increasing the load it can take, so preloading it. And that will change how much the system sags in. So if I got onto this kid's bike now with my near 70 kilos, we'd expect it to be at least 50 to 60 to maybe almost fully maxed out. We don't want that. We want the suspension to be able to drop into those holes and also absorb those bigger compressions. So setting sag is essential, and we'll show you how now. Setting sag is easy enough. You can follow the same setup as you would on your bike. To set the sag, you need to get your kid kitted up with all their riding gear, with their helmet, their backpack. If they normally ride with some certain shoes, make sure they're wearing those, because all of that will add to their riding weight, and that's essential to get the right sag of when they're on the bike. To measure the sag, we're going to measure on the forks. It's very simple. We're measuring all of the stroke of the front fork. So if it's got 100 mil of travel, we want to measure about 25 to 30 mil of sag. On a rear suspension system, it gets a little bit more complicated, and you'll have to measure the stroke length of the shock. So that's the section that moves in. Measuring just eye to eye won't necessarily get you the right number. With the bike leant against the wall, hold on to your child and get them to rest their full weight onto the bike. You're aiming for about 30% sag on the rear shock as a starter. If there's no sag guide, don't worry, you can put a zip tie on to measure the stroke on either the fork or the shock. You can use a shock pump just like you would on your own bike. So add or remove air from the system until you've reached that perfect sag for the bike, between 25 and 30% sag. With a rear shock set, now it's time to do the same, but for the fork. Now, it's probably best if you can get your child to stand up and move slightly forward so their hips are above the bottom bracket and that they're just slightly above the saddle. This will mean that they're loading the front of the fork a little bit more. And it should sag, so make sure there's an O-ring or a zip tie on the fork and push this all the way down to the seal. Slowly get them to come off the bike. You might have to lift them here and then check the O-ring. We're looking for a good base setup is around 25% of sag. Much as you would with your own air fork, use a shock pump to add and remove the air, the preloaded air, to change the spring rate inside the fork. So adding more air to reduce the sag, or dropping air out, reducing the air inside to boost that sag. So we've mentioned that kids grow, and that means that as they grow, they're going to change how much the suspension system is sagging. So do check it fairly regularly. You'll be surprised how quickly a child can change the sag setting and how that'll change the dynamics of their ride on their bike. So do it fairly regularly. If they're growing and you're marking it on the kitchen wall, then it's probably a good idea to reset sag at the same time. Just as you'd find on a grown-up suspension, we've got rebound and compression damping to play with too. This is a bit more complicated to set up than what we've gone through so far, so be sure to check out one of our dedicated suspension setup videos to find out how to get the most out of them. So final tip is, much like on your suspension, is to check that you're getting full travel. Obviously it can be a little bit trickier to know and explain, oh yeah, you definitely bottomed out there to your child, but just check. You can often see if there's a dirt line, or if you've got an O-ring on your shock, use that. If you can get away with running a little bit lower pressure, that's going to aid grip and just be a more comfortable ride, which hopefully builds more stoke and more joy for mountain biking. Now, it's easy to overlook, because I feel like lots of adult riders overlook this as well, and that's your first and probably last bit of your suspension is the tyres. So with a 20-inch or 24-inch and the weight of a child, you can go much lower than you might expect. You can go down 15 to 20 psi. Obviously don't go too low, because you open up the risk of pinch flats and or damaged rims, which is expensive and a hassle on the trail. But lower tyre pressure is going to help boost comfort and boost grip. So yeah, try some lower tyre pressure, lower than you might imagine. So it may take a little bit of time, but setting up your kid's bike is well worth it. Why? Because when you've got the controls, the gears, the brakes in the right spot, when you've got the saddle in that Goldilocks position, when you've got the suspension tuned just right, and of course the tyre pressure at just the right pressure, well, your child's going to have just a much more enjoyable mountain biking experience, and hopefully they'll be well on the way to becoming a fan, just like you are. And well, more mountain bike fans the better, hey?